In the meantime, if you can introduce yourselves in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from, and what you hope to get out from this evening. And throughout our hour together, if you should have any questions or any comments or anything you'd like to share with the panelists, please drop those in the chat, or we have a Q&A feature on the screen for you to submit your questions. But thank you all for being here. We're really excited that you're able to join us. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for joining CODEPINK's DNC commentary. We're excited that you made time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. My name is Nancy Mancias. I am a campaign organizer with CODEPINK. Throughout our hour together, if you should have any questions or any comments, please put them in the chat, and our chat monitoring team will definitely pick that up. If you're just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you are coming from or where you're joining us from. Hi, Medea.
Hello, how are you?
I'm terrific. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. Okay. So as participants are trickling in, we are asking them to introduce themselves in the chat and tell us where they're joining us from. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll start with our opening remarks. Welcome, Phyllis.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Phyllis.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and start with our opening remarks. I'll hand it off to Medea. And if you'd like to share anything, we've had 2 days of a Democratic National Convention. We're on the third night. What have been some of your takeaways, Medea?
It's been difficult to see how many Republicans have been highlighted. I understand having maybe one or two to try to win over some of the former Trump supporters, but it really needs to be balanced with what the party represents. And we have had the first night, we had John Kasich and a whole bunch of other Republicans. And then last night, we had Colin Powell, which I think was a huge mistake, a big slap in the face to the majority of Democrats who are anti-war supporters. And then we had Cindy McCain also representing her husband as a war hawk. We had Chuck Hagel. And so I think it really went over the top in terms of trying to portray the Biden Kamala Harris ticket as one that would be business as usual. And when it comes to war and peace, that means the military industrial complex in control and the war is continuing. I also feel that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is a very large part of the party. And to only get Bernie Sanders and that 1.5 glorious minutes of AOC was really not enough and not balanced. So I think when you look at where the energy of the movement lies, and that the Democrats to win have to bring in the energy that we saw in the Sanders campaign, that we see in the probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've come out to Black Lives Matter marches, the hundreds of thousands of people, particularly young people, that have come out for environmental protests and have been part of pushing for the Green New Deal. And all of the people now in the midst of a pandemic that if they didn't understand before and now do understand why we need Medicare for all, and that we have to reprioritize our budget spending. I think this is not recognizing both the shifting perceptions and needs and energy in the Democratic Party. And lastly, I want to say that while we in the peace movement might not be in a position to be able to get lots of people out on the streets these days, we do represent by far the majority sentiment in the Democratic Party that wants to see an end to the endless wars, that wants to see budget cuts, significant budget cuts that unfortunately neither Biden nor Kamala Harris have been in favor of, and that does want to see a retooling of our foreign policy to be one based on diplomacy and cooperation. So that bodes well for the future if we can get Trump out of the White House, because we will be in a much better position to put the pressure on a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris ticket in the White House than we have been able to do under Trump. So I think while it's been difficult to watch some of these proceedings because they don't represent some of the issues that we're working on, it's important to keep our eyes on the prize, which is to get Trump out of the White House and keep building up the movement so that there is no lag time between Biden getting elected and criticizing and pushing Biden and Kamala Harris to take us into a foreign policy that is not based on militarism anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medea, for sharing your takeaways from the first two nights. Tonight is the third night. We do expect to see Kamala Harris take to the stage, but we're really excited that you all are able to join us this evening. And we want to give you the tools and resources to continue to do the work, to continue to push the Democrats and the Republicans. No matter what the turnout is, well, what happens after the election, we want to continue pushing, and we want to bring the people power, the people's movement into the streets and into the halls of Congress. So now we have a great lineup, a great program for you this evening. We have Phyllis Dennis, we have Katie Seeger, and we have Vijay, Prashad joining us. We have Leonardo Flores, who will talk about Latin America policy. And we also have our co-director, Carly Town, who will talk about divesting from the war and what we can do around Congress. So now I'm going to shift gears and pass it over to Jody Evans.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm already feeling better. Last night had me so depressed, just being together with you all. I want to bring up Phyllis Dennis of the Institute for Policy Studies, who has been essential to our work since the very beginning of CODEPINK. We could look to Phyllis almost immediately after a global event or a vote in Congress, and she would brilliantly deconstruct it into talking points, the ones we needed to disarm the mainstream media story and educate our community to be effective in addressing the moment. I have a favorite Phyllis story. She pulled together 10 points needed for diplomacy with Syria before, while Obama was trying to get Congress to bomb them. And it was her talking points that stopped Obama's drive for a war on Syria. The peace movement would be nowhere without her. So I want to turn it over to Phyllis Dennis.
Thank you, Jody. My only response to that is I wish that any of us could say that our talking points is what led Obama to his wonderful temporary decision at that moment. It was a huge victory for our movement. I would doubt that mine or anybody else's talking points were so specifically engaged. Thank you all for being part of this tonight. One of the things that we're looking at, what Medea said earlier, and I stand by everything Medea said, the first night we heard not a word about internationalism, about war and peace, about foreign policy at all. There was one phrase from Michelle Obama, and she was talking about the power of the presidency, and she referenced how the president can make war or sue for peace. That was it. We didn't hear anything else about foreign policy. And last night, the so-called foreign policy discussion was not only filled with Republicans, but it was only about the military. There was nothing about diplomacy. There was nothing about what else foreign policy should look like. It was a pretty shameful display. And particularly given that as limited as the proposals of the Democratic Party platform are on foreign policy, there is some pretty good language, ironically enough, in the platform about foreign policy, about diplomacy in particular. So the fact that it wasn't even mentioned, that nobody felt compelled, nobody felt that there was any accountability to anyone else to move forward on this, is really a statement about where we are on this. I think going forward, we do need to start with the understanding that if we look at the entire level of divides, the many divides between the progressive wing of the party, which, as we know, is on a roll, it's growing, it's more powerful, it's more visible, it's younger, which is hugely important because it's the wave of the future and not the past. Despite the gap between that wing and the centrist, neoliberal, right wing, whatever you want to call it, other guys, the traditional wing of the Democratic Party, in all of those ways, I would say that the gap is the widest when it comes to foreign policy. So it's not to say that there are not huge differences between the progressive wing and the rest on issues of healthcare, of the economy, on racial justice, on women's rights, on all those things. There are. But the presence of people, progressives in Congress who ran on those issues, who ran on a Green New Deal, ran on Medicare for all, nobody really ran directly on changing US foreign policy. Many of our champions hold that up, but it's not yet representative of a component of a movement that they have no choice but to relate to. If we look at the teams that were put together, the Bernie Biden unity teams, right? There were 6 of them. And each team had, I think it was 4 people from the Biden camp and 3 from Bernie's camp. So it recognized who won, but they were still, very representative. And there was an understanding that they had to have Bernie's people there. They didn't have one on foreign policy. And while there was a little bit of pushback, there wasn't ultimately any move to do that. So I think that that's one of the things that we see going forward, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a situation where that gap is the biggest. And if we look at the presence at the convention, who's missing? It's not only people who would talk about diplomacy, who would talk about opposing wars, it's young people at all. Even the Washington Post talked about how This was the old guard of Biden's foreign policy, of Washington's foreign policy. And what they're trying to do is to reclaim, not end, US exceptionalism. I think that's the fundamental takeaway here. They are claiming that Trump has abandoned American exceptionalism with his call for America first. And it's our job as the Biden stability, calm, let's go back to how things used to be. We will reclaim American exceptionalism. That's what we are here to figure out how to challenge. And that's not going to be easy. So if we look first, just really quickly at sort of where we are in the world, what's the political motion, the political moment, overall, US global domination is not on the rise. It's shrinking slowly, but it's not on a post-Cold War trajectory where the US won the Cold War and is now the leading force in the world in every possible way. China's economy is catching up to the US and will soon match it. China's economic clout, particularly in Africa and in a number of other places, but Africa most of all, is hugely important. It's eclipsing that of the United States. We see a combination of Europe, at least most of Europe, Russia and China collectively resisting the US efforts at the United Nations, for example, to reimpose new global sanctions on Iran. That would not have happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But, and there's a bunch of other things, I'm obviously not going to go through it all now, but the US is still the strongest power in the world, both economically and militarily. Its military spending still surpasses the 10 next biggest military spenders. It's building a very dangerous anti-Iran coalition centered by Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East that's threatening a new war against Iran. It's trying to rebuild an even stronger and more US-dominated NATO. The possibilities of wars breaking out with either Korea or Iran, not because either side necessarily wants to launch a full-scale war, but because the tensions are so high and the possibilities of pulling back from a so-called accidental move are almost impossible in those arenas. Everything is really very, very dangerous. There's the threat of a new Cold War with China as the US continues its provocative actions against China. AFRICOM is still in control of all of US foreign policy in Africa, militarizing all of it. The global war on terror remains a serious challenge, even though the nature of the wars has changed profoundly. And diplomacy, frankly, is still a rarity and is still used far too often as a way of preparing the ground for military action rather than being used instead of military action. So that's the moment that we're looking at, and it's a very dangerous moment, particularly when there's this huge gap in the Democratic Party between the progressive wing and the centrist wing. So what are we seeing? We're seeing the lack of young people. We're seeing a focus on looking back at reclaiming what the US was as the global military power, not looking forward to a new era where diplomacy and cooperation replace the reliance on military force, and this notion of wanting to reclaim rather than abandon US exceptionalism and defining that in a purely military sense. So we saw the first night, again, no real discussion, no mention even of foreign policy, the one little phrase from Michelle Obama. And then last night, foreign policy completely limited to the military stuff. Biden as commander-in-chief will be so much stronger. Biden will make America stronger. This is all about the old guard, the old guard of the deep state, for those who like to see it as conspiracies. But it is real that it was a long-time Washington consensus that the military leads, and that's the consensus that we were hearing last night. From Colin Powell, we heard that it's great because Biden will trust our intelligence agencies. The problem with Trump is that he didn't trust the CIA and the DIA and the other intelligence agencies. That Biden, unlike Trump, would stand up to our adversaries with strength and experience so they will know we mean business. That's what he's praising Biden for. And we would be proud to salute him as the commander-in-chief. This is Colin Powell. John Kerry, focusing on Trump having been too soft on Russia, not presumably going to war with Russia. Anything else is too soft. And talking about Biden's credentials, it was fascinating to see. He talked about Biden's credentials as a great leader because he supported going to war in Kosovo, in the one war that the US deliberately decided that because they would never get support from the United Nations Security Council, they would simply not ask and instead go to NATO, to the NATO High Command, and get permission, which is one of those, what? Who said you can do that? You know, NATO isn't in any international law that says that a NATO approval is okay to go to war. And it's one of those things where if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you're NATO, everything needs military intervention. So if you go to NATO and say, oh, there's a problem over here, we think it needs military intervention, NATO's response is absolutely. What can we do to help? You know, and what he didn't mention, what Kerry didn't mention in looking at Biden's great military credentials was his support for the war in Iraq. Didn't even mention it. Didn't say he voted for it, but changed his mind later. Didn't say that he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when he denied the right to testify to the 2 or 3 anti-war people who were supposed to testify. And on the night before the hearing said, actually, you can submit your testimony by written form. And all the people, all 18 people who testified were all supporters of the war. He didn't mention any of that, not any of it. Chuck Hagel, that he would feel safe in the Situation Room with Biden in there, that Trump was the one who had failed the troops. And then, of course, McCain. McCain is the great buddy of Joe Biden. They trust each other, we're friends. And we all remember what was the most famous thing that John McCain ever did. It was making up his little ditty, bomb, 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 Iran. Became very famous, very cute about the slaughter of innocents across Iran. So this is what we're dealing with. You know, the Washington Post saying that Trump has rejected the notion that the United States is unique from every other country. He has engaged in false moral equivalency, befriended autocrats, and that it's the Washington old guard, according to the Post, that argues that Joe Biden would restore American exceptionalism. So what do we do about that? When there's nothing about diplomacy, not even the Iran deal was talked about, which was clearly President Obama's biggest diplomatic achievement, his biggest diplomatic success, and arguably his biggest foreign policy success across the board. So that's what we're faced with. So what do we think about that? So the language of the platform has some decent language in it. The problem is we know that platforms are not binding on the party, on the candidate, on the sitting president, and there's no real accountability even to candidates who violate it. So we have to use it as a tool, holding it up and saying, you may not feel bound by this, but we are demanding that you make good on these commitments, that you treat them as commitments. So the platform calls for ending the endless wars. There's a lot about diplomacy being the main component of US foreign policy. The platform admits that the US, quote, spends 13 times more on the military than we do on diplomacy. We spend 5 times more in Afghanistan every year than we do on global public health and preventing the next pandemic. We can maintain a strong defense and protect our safety and security for less. Now, that's fine. The downside, there's no call to actually cut the military budget. So that's a problem. So we have to move past that and say, okay, that's a good commitment, ending endless wars. We should stop spending 13 times more on the military, et cetera, et cetera. How do you do that? You cut the military budget. We can start by going back to the 10%. Now that was chump change, let's be clear. But chump change in the context of a $737 billion budget is a lot of money. So it's fine if they want to start with cutting 10%. Granted, it's a rounding error, but still it has never happened before. Never has Congress voted to reduce the military budget other than immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. Otherwise, it's always been on an upward trajectory. So deciding to reduce it even by only 10% would be incredible. If we could push them to the 200%, that's the basis of the People Over Pentagon campaign, that's what we need to do. And we need to be looking forward to the moment when we can push them for the big one, the $350 billion cut, the half cut, which is called for, we call for that at IPS and the National Priorities Project. The Poor People's Campaign is calling for that, and others as well. So moving to that should be our goal. But this is one of those great ones where each of the interim steps is a good thing. Support them all. So that's one of the ways we have to think about how we deal with the Democrats in this move forward. The platform says that we should immediately rejoin the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. That's fine. We should. It was an outrage that Trump pulled out of that. But we have to simultaneously be clear that that agreement never went far enough in the first place. So going back to it is only the first step towards reopening negotiations towards a global Green New Deal, making real that commitment of the progressive wing of the party to say, if we're going to be serious about a Green New Deal in the United States, we need to support other countries' abilities to create a Green New Deal in their own country and a global Green New Deal for the world as a whole. The notion that prioritizing diplomacy over war is crucial, and the platform talks a lot about that. That means we also have to end economic sanctions and stop treating sanctions as an alternative to war that somehow count as diplomacy. It's one of the illusions that they get away with far too often. So one of the ways we have to insist that they enforce this notion of diplomacy and not war is to say diplomacy and not sanctions, because sanctions are a tool of war, not an alternative to war. So that means that the sanctions that are killing children in Venezuela, in Iran, elsewhere as well, has to be ended. Just as we have to say that it's not enough to talk about the expose, not enough to expose that we are spending 53 cents of every federal dollar on the military, although they didn't use that particular quote. That's one of our favorites. But to say we have to cut it. We have to cut it. So let me just quickly, how much time should I go? Should I stop? I don't know where we are on
a couple more minutes till I introduce Vijay.
Okay. I'm going to skip what I was going to do, which is to look at sort of 5 principles of what a progressive foreign policy could look like, and just talk for a second about what we're going to need from a new administration, and 1 minute on how we're going to start by building it. We need to reject US exceptionalism, not try and reclaim it. We need to reject the reliance on military force and domination in favor of cooperation and diplomacy as the basis of our foreign policy. That's number 1. We need to end the existing and prevent the new wars. That means preventing war with Iran and North Korea, stopping the potential war in Venezuela, and stop the new and existing economic sanctions that are killing people around the world. We need to cut the military budget massively through linking with a global Green New Deal. And the way to do that, and I'll end with this part, as we look at sort of what were the successes of the Obama administration, where we would say, yeah, go back to that. That was the diplomatic stuff. The failures were all the military stuff. So how do we make this real? Part of it has to do with shoring up our own movement. And yes, we have to be in the streets from the day after the election, the day after the inauguration, and on into next year. We also have to be sure that it's not only about strengthening the self-defined peace movement, because the question particularly of cutting the military budget is central to the work of the climate justice movement, the women's rights movement, the immigrant rights movement, the movement for the rights of refugees, the movements for Black freedom, the movement for Palestinian rights, all depend on getting money out of the hands of the military and on these domestic movements, getting it into the hands of people that are fighting for a Green New Deal, people that are fighting for Medicare for all, people that are fighting for a free college education. Because the biggest challenge that they face is not that people don't like the idea of free college education or Medicare for all. It always comes back to, well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, now we've got an answer. The answer is we start by cutting the military budget in half. And that's what gives us, and that's what gives the movement for Medicare for all, the movement for a Green New Deal, the movement for a free college education, all of these things. That's what gives them the tool to say, we have an answer for that. The answer is cut the military budget. You cut $350 billion, and we'll have enough money for a good start on all of them. It's not enough to pay for all of them forever, but it's a really good start on all of them. So the final point is, what do we do to start making this real? And I think this is where we get to the question of linkage, making clear that how we define the anti-war movement goes way beyond our own organizations that are self-defined as peace groups, anti-war groups, internationalist groups. It means looking to our links with the Movement for Black Lives, with the immigrant rights movement, with the folks at United We Dream, with 350.org and Greenpeace and the others that with Sunrise, all those that are fighting for a Green New Deal, the folks that are working on the ending the 1033 campaign of the Pentagon to stop the militarization of communities across this country. That's a peace issue, because where are those tanks and armored personnel carriers coming from? They're coming from wars that are continuing. And all of the work that we do, and I'll end with this, when we talk about cutting the military budget, we have to be the ones to make sure that there's always two reasons given. More and more organizations are starting to take up this question of it costs too much. We can't keep paying this if we're going to have money for all the desperately needed things to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the issues of the legacies of racial discrimination in this country, to deal with the legacies of slavery and the need for reparations, to deal with the rights of Native people, the protection of water. All of those things need massive amounts of money. We need to cut the military budget. We support all of that. And we demand that they cut the military budget so that we stop killing people around the world also. So it's both things that we have to talk about. Everything else can wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. So just so you know, we're not waiting until the election's over. CODEPINK is engaged every day. And the people listening are working to hold accountable those members of Congress that are Democrats that didn't vote for the 10% cut and take money from weapons manufacturers. You know, we worked just today, we got a city to divest from weapons. San Luis Obispo City Council voted. We have many people running for Congress that have committed to not taking money from weapons. So we don't rest, this community that you're talking to. And we so appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today. So, and you know, definitely we're engaged in all those movements and see ourselves as a bigger part of the movement. I just want to bring up Fire Drill Fridays, which was one of the things that, you know, really helped integrate all of us together to remember we're all in this together. And so next I want to bring to the screen Vijay Prashad, who has just been a beacon of light in our work. He has been there for our summits. He's been there to support so much of what we do and help us keep our issues connected to global struggles. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist and founder and director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. If you want to be smarter about the world that we live in, you must subscribe and follow Vijay on social media. It will make you happier and nourish your heart. So Vijay, if I could bring you in and you could bring more of the global community into this conversation.
It's great to be with you. It's great to be with friends. And first thing, I don't know anything about Beacon of Light, Jody, because today Zoe and I published an article about the assassination of a 32-year-old young leader in Colombia. His name is Patron, one of many that are being killed in that country. You know, the country led by Ivan Duque, great friend of Trump, and so on. I really appreciate everything I heard Phyllis talking about. I agree with, you know, everything, always what she says. I'll just make a few points if that's okay, Jody, and then, you know, we can take it from there. You know, the first thing is that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are not just running to be the president of the United States, because one of the, I think, classic illusions of this kind of situation is where you believe that they're running to head a republic. In fact, they're running to head a military. I mean, you've seen this over and over, that US presidents keep referring to themselves as the commander-in-chief, and they will enter the most dangerous job on the planet. They'll have command over an enormous military arsenal. They'll have command over instruments that can, you know, throttle countries. And that's really what they're running for. You know, I've never seen anybody run to be a president in a democratic sense of a people and leave it at that. They're always running to suffocate the world. That's part of the agenda. And I was stunned, actually, in the New York Times to read Mr. Biden has offered few detailed policy plans to address how he would tackle this very changed world. That's interesting. I was stunned to read that. The cavalierness, what does it matter? Because we have the capacity. I'll get to this idea of the changed world in a second. But, I think we should just recognize that this is not a choice between the bad and the good. This is a choice between two people who are running for the most dangerous office on the planet. And until we have a class configuration in the United States where we can reshape what that office means, we should never enter this with any illusions. That doesn't mean I'm saying there's no difference between them. I'm just saying that the office they're running for is a very dangerous office. And we don't have the capacity to shift what that office means now. And I think we should, in that sense, be realistic about what's happening. The first thing is I'm not actually even thinking of November and post-November, Jody, because, there's a well-known political science phrase called rallying around the flag effect. And Trump is behind in the polls, and it's very likely that he is going to start some sort of shooting war, either in Iran, Venezuela, maybe in the South China Sea. Some adventure might take place to boost his rankings so that even the Democrats will rally around Trump and that he has a chance to win the election. I mean, we have to be extraordinarily vigilant. And I think the softest target, most dangerous situation is around Venezuela. And I think real clarity that Trump might very plausibly before November conduct some kind of police action or bombing raid against a country is highly likely. Linked to that is the fact that it's not a question that the US might go to war against Iran or might go to war against Venezuela. The United States is at war against Iran, and it is at war against Venezuela. There are many ways to understand war. We don't understand war merely by a bombing run. War has to be understood as a hybrid war. When you go after a country with economic war, with diplomatic war, throwing country out of, international bodies and so on, when you prevent a country from its rightful, claim on the IMF to get loans and so on, as the U.S. Treasury Department did to Venezuela just recently, when you have the impact of using various forms of sabotage against a country, very likely against the electrical system in Venezuela, you're already at war. The United States government doesn't declare wars. We know that. The War Powers Act is a joke. When has the US government actually, through Congress, declared a war against a country, in recent times? I mean, was there a war declared against Cambodia? I don't think so. United States government bombed Cambodia and Laos ruthlessly. There was no declaration of war. Laos, a country of 8 million people, has had no coronavirus deaths. It borders China. It has a socialist government, a superb government, which a very poor country, Vietnam, handful of deaths from COVID-19, bombed. Where was the declaration of war? This is not a country that is a war-based country. A law-based country. It is a war-based country, but it's not law-based. It doesn't declare war. It just does it. Last night, the Democrats welcomed Colin Powell to speak on their stage. This is a man who, whether he knew he was lying at the United Nations or was hoodwinked, and I know that there's ambiguity here. Lawrence Wilkerson, his aide, claims that there may have been ambiguity. I really don't care. Your integrity is measured when you go before an international body and speak on behalf of a government, and you believe what they're saying. Apparently in the last minute he changed his speech at that UN presentation. He should have just said, I'm not going to speak until I can personally verify this extraordinarily explosive evidence. He didn't bother. He did it. He held that ridiculous vial. It's a man. This man has no integrity, in my opinion. From the world looking in, there's no integrity. You lied in front of the UN in order to go to war and further destroy a country that the United States had already destroyed. We all remember Madeleine Albright saying that 500,000 Iraqi children dead because of US sanctions. Remember, that was already war. 500,000 children dead, she says, a price worth paying. Later, she's regretted that statement, and she said many times, I shouldn't have spoken like that. But you did. I mean, you did speak like that. He did go before, the UN and lie. These are things they have done. For lesser things, we are held to such high account. For lesser things, we are held to such a high account. Phyllis can tell you entire career of defending the people of Palestine. We are held to the highest account for that. Maligned, our integrity besmirched, dragged through the mud in front of liberalism, constantly called anti-Semites, this, that, and the other. Regularly our integrity is besmirched. Neither Phyllis Dennis nor I have ever been before the United Nations holding a vial and lying to go and destroy a country. Neither Phyllis Dennis nor I. Neither Phyllis Dennis nor I have been on an American television program and said the death of 500,000 children is a price worth paying. These are Democrats or near Democrats. This is a warmongering institution. They are already at war. They don't need to declare war. And I think that's something we need to explain to people. The very presence of up to 800 military installations globally at enormous cost to the US taxpayer, up to 800 installations. I don't accept the low number for bases. Shannon Air Base in Ireland is a US military installation because CIA planes land there to refuel when they take prisoners to black sites. Bangkok Auxiliary Airport is a US military base because the US has a warehouse there which has supplies. Fine, there's no sign that says base like in Agadez, where there's actually flags flying and so on. I think if you accept their number, you're missing the fact that the United States, by this enormous military presence around the world, already is at war with the world. It's not just at war with Iran and with Venezuela, it's at war with the world. The United Arab Emirates has just made a deal with Israel. It's shocking to a lot of people. But, I remember interviewing people in the Indian government after India normalized with Israel. And they said, look, we were told by the US State Department after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were told that the road to Washington, D.C. goes through Tel Aviv. If you want to normalize with the US government, you have to normalize with Israel. And the United States has put enormous pressure on these Gulf countries. I mean, I have no sympathy with any of them. The Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these are all despicable leaderships. But nonetheless, they are under pressure, from whom? Not the Israelis, from Washington, D.C. This is a wretched ruling class. That's the bottom line, guys. It's a wretched. How are we going to go and campaign among the people? Not just to prevent a future war, but to explain to people that this government has permanently been at war. It's permanently been at war against the Iranians, against the Venezuelans. And I mean, let's not forget, the United States government has permanently been at war against the North Koreans since the 1950s, since US troops went there. That war has never ended. There's never been an end to that war. So that's become a permanent multi-generational war. I actually find it bewildering when people say Afghanistan is the longest war. It's not. You're still at war against the North Korean people. You still make horrible statements about those people there, saying we'll do this to you, we'll do that to you, and so on. So I just want to say, I so admire CODEPINK. I agree with everything. I have nothing to share with you that you don't know. I admire everything that you do. I agree with all your campaigns, specifically now the campaign to prevent a war on China. And I've been very involved with a platform called No New Cold War. And I'm very glad that we're all working together. I watched Jodi's webinar with John Ross. I thought that was extraordinary. The one you did with Tings this week was excellent. I have nothing to tell you except that I think we're doing an inadequate job, campaigning among the people of the United States, because we always seem to campaign saying, let's prevent a war. We haven't adequately campaigned to say that this ruling class is permanently at war, and that the reason it collapses when you have social troubles, where it cannot deal with your unemployment insurance, it refuses to lift you up socially. It's because they are addicted to this permanent war. That's where your social surplus goes. It's not going to come and take care of you and take care of your families and build your bridges and so on. there's a permanent war which sucks the life out of the exchequer, out of the treasury, which means it sucks the life out of the communities. I mean, we talk about a peace economy. You can't have a peace economy when the ruling class has you permanently at war. How do you campaign among a people saying that that's what's destroying not only the planet, it's destroying your own communities?
Thank you, Vijay. I mean, we're kind of doing this today because after last night, our community, our peace activist community is really depressed. It's very hard to figure out how to be when we know what you're saying. We're up, you know it, and then when you watch it last night, it's like so in your face, and it's kind of in your face in a way that you feel like it's a boot and it wants to just smush you. It's so violently and provocatively in your face with no apology. And so, it's really like, how do we keep our energy up to, none of us, we know that it's not about Bush or Obama or Trump or Biden, that it's a system. So we don't get involved in elections. We do show up to vote, but it's really like, as we have since we started CODEPINK, what do we do election year? And we just need to be reminded, and need to be nourished by you and Phyllis, that yes, there are things we can do. Yes, we're connected to brilliance and we can figure this out. And then yes, we have to keep hitting the streets. So just a question of like, where do you see places where we could be effective in the election, to be building what we need for January? Because we also know that no matter who gets elected, it's really Congress that's retarded. That we know we have 65% of the country that doesn't want to fund wants to cut the Pentagon budget, but it was a dismal showing on that vote, dismal. And that it really is just the retardation of Congress and being owned by weapons companies. But it's also just a contortion of the American mind. And, when you look out and you see that the spirits are being bent, and we can't take that lightly. We know that when you're inside of a culture, what your spirit is bent to do is real. And I think that the Biden campaign knows that they're able to bend some spirits. They're able to break your commitment to a certain value because you're so afraid of this evil. And it's been used, it's the oldest trick in the book, but it's real. It's not to be taken lightly. So for us, it's like, how do we stay committed to our values, stay in the streets, working, and not, get sucked up into which looks frightening right now as people get sucked into this machine and you're just like, what just happened to people's brains? And stay, it's like, and, be connected and find the ways. And I mean, we talked about light. I mean, the fact that, yesterday, the Gaza power plant ran out of fuel. I mean, that happens. Well, we pointed out earlier, it's like AOC was the only one that talked about the oppressors and movements in a night full of oppressors and people talking about an individual. So how do we keep our spirits up? And is there a place, during the next 3 months where we could really put our energies that doesn't freak everybody out, but also, with Obama we weren't for Obama during the whole election cycle. And our thing was keep your promises for peace, because he kept saying he promised peace. And so we were just the gnats that kept reminding him that no, there's no such thing as a good war, which he kept saying. But yeah, any suggestions you have on what the team can be doing? Phyllis?
Just on a couple things. I think it's really important that we there's a couple things that seem contradictory and we have to hold them both at the same time. One is that these are systemic issues. This is a ruling class that makes these decisions. It's also true that it matters which wings of the class are in power at any given time. it is more dangerous for the people at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchies in this country and globally when Trump and his cronies are in power than when Biden and his cronies are in power, I would assert. And I think it's very, very dangerous for us to lose sight of that. The difference between good and bad is not as big as the difference between, wait, see if I get this right. The difference between good and bad is not as big as the difference between bad and worse when you're talking about the very end. There's an old saying about how if you're drowning and the water is up over your mouth, the last half inch to your nose is life and death. It's only half an inch, but that's life and death. And when we're talking about the people at the bottom who have the least access to power, the least access to survival, the least access to healthcare, water, food, anything, it matters enormously whether one wing or the other wing of the ruling class is in power. So I think that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. We have an obligation to those people that are at the bottom of the hierarchies that define this country, racial, economic, gender, all the hierarchies. People at the bottom are the ones who will pay the biggest price for those who sit back and say, well, there's no difference between between Trump and Biden, and so really don't even bother voting. I was in a meeting this morning where a young African-American activist who I was sort of stunned to hear somebody like that say it, very smart guy, good writer, all those things, said, nobody's going to convince me to vote for them. What difference is it? And I was like, oh my God, there's a huge difference. So that's one thing. It comes back partly to what I was saying at the very beginning and what Vijay touched on too, that it's in the question of foreign policy that there is the most unity between all the wings of the ruling class. But we don't only live in a foreign policy world. We also have obligations to the movements that are working on issues in this country, where the difference of whether it's women's rights, whether it's any of the economic issues, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the post office, whether it's the ability to vote, there are huge differences between the various wings of the ruling class because they have different assessments of where their interests lie. Not because they're on our side, but it's because their own definitions of their own self-interests have wide variances. And some of them are far more dangerous than others. The other side is, where can our protests hope to have a little more influence than someplace else? I would rather be fighting every day, protesting outside a Biden White House than protesting outside a Trump White House. Not just because Trump is more likely to send the Marines out into the street to knock around heads and use a lot more tear gas. And that's a factor, but that's not the main factor. The main factor is there are people in the orbit that that I can't even keep these guys straight, that Biden and his people have to be accountable to that are much closer to us. So the fact that we have champions in Congress, really for the first time in any numbers, there's always been one or two people, but the fact that we have a squad and we just elected 3 more young women of color and 1 man, our token man in there. This is changing things. It's absolutely changing things. It doesn't change things overnight. Congress people themselves still live in a bubble. They still don't read the press. They still believe some of these guys, some of our close friends on domestic issues still really believe it's political suicide to criticize Israel. They're not prepared to believe what the polls tell them, that young Jews, young Democrats, and especially young Democratic Jews have completely broken with Israel. It's just not an issue anymore. They don't buy it. They don't buy it. And we keep telling them, but we're not doing enough to show them. And it's that challenge that I think we're looking at. So one of the things I think people who are really reluctant, and I get that, to not want to campaign for Biden, campaigning against Trump makes sense because of the policies, not because it's an individual, not because it's a party. I work for a nonprofit. We don't work on candidates, but we do work on policies. So saying that these policies are far more dangerous than these less dangerous policies is absolutely crucial. The other side of it, there's a whole bunch of people running for all kinds of things whose elections will begin to change things at the level of city councils, at the level of state assemblies, in all those ways. So an example like the 1033 program, that is this Pentagon program that sends armored personnel carriers into the streets of Ferguson, for instance, after Mike Brown was killed. City councils make those decisions. City councils can bring that program.
We have had that campaign for 5
Exactly.
years.
Exactly.
So,
and in a bunch of cities,
report back that from working on that campaign, one of the really sad things is that we learned how much power police departments have over mayors and city councils.
right?
It's
but
kind
those
of
are still
reflective
local
of-
campaigns, and what we're seeing is they're forced now to take that into account. I mean, that's what Black Lives Matter has begun. It doesn't mean that the policies have all changed, but the fact that they now have to use different language, the fact that they now have to go through the motions of looking like they are responding, is the first step towards being held accountable to really responding, to saying this is not what keeps people safe, that we need to take money away from police forces and have entirely new visions of what it means for people to be safe in their community. That's how it starts. It's a first step, but we never had a first step before. It took the killing of one more Black man in the street, for whatever reason it was, that one hit people the way it did. It's had this huge impact that sets the stage for far more real, profound changes, which haven't happened yet. But they're part of the election process too.
Yes, and thanks for connecting. We do try to connect our work, the militarism at home that's come from the militarism that we have taken abroad. But Vijay, I know you have to leave, and I wonder if you have any anything to help the team know where we should focus our energies.
Well, I don't want to say anything that's too optimistic. Our motto always, is from Mahdi Amel, as long as you are resisting, you're not defeated. So let's just take that as a statement of fact. I think really we are in a long period of trying to understand what's going wrong in the left, a long period globally. You have Bolsonaro in Brazil, for instance, falling over his feet, being an insane person, not concerned about the pandemic, and his poll numbers rise. You have Narendra Modi in India, vicious policy towards migrant labor, no concern on the pandemic, his poll numbers rise. Now, I know some people will scratch their head and say, well, polls are not reliable of anything, but these people get elected and they get re-elected and so on. We really have to think hard about what's happening between our utopia that we have on offer, a world of peace, a world of justice, a world of socialism. Why is it that our utopia doesn't grip the mass of people? We have to really think about this, which is why we are in a prolonged struggle. I mean, you're talking about November, January. I'm talking about the next 25 years. We have to have patience. We have to build. We believe in certain principles. We believe fundamentally. This is irreducible for me. I'm a socialist. I don't believe that because socialism is difficult as a force to grip people's minds, I should become something else. You're not an opportunist. You believe in certain principles. That's irreducible. But we have to face up to the fact that our principles aren't gripping people like they should. It's not intuitive, Yeah, I agree. There are people elected on the left and so on. They're elected in districts where they should have been elected 50 years ago, Phyllis. I mean, why is it that in these boroughs of New York, rotten democratic boroughs, you've allowed centrist Democrats to continue when those were left constituencies for years and years in Massachusetts and so on? The Republicans in rotten Republican right-wing boroughs, they went right. They went hard right and sent hard right people. Democrats continue to send these boring democratic centrists from hard left districts. This is not a new, I wouldn't not like to overestimate the entry of AOC and so on, because I think the districts haven't changed left. It's that now people are contesting these, I mean, you're following Alex Moss in Massachusetts, who was smeared by probably Richard Neal's campaign. Richard Neal, I can't believe that Richard Neal has been in Congress from a district which, admittedly is not a left district, but has a huge left constituency. Nonetheless, they've not been challenged. It's great this is happening, but our ideas just don't grip people. And we really need to think about this. Look at this. The campaign you are running, you're involved in on Cuban doctors getting the Nobel Prize. This is a no-brainer. This is a no-brainer. This should not be something you need. And yet, as Medea told me today, it's not only Trump who's maligning the Cuban doctors, it's Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch releases a report attacking the Cuban doctors. That's a liberal outfit, frankly. I don't agree that it's a it's a liberal outfit. It appeals to liberals. It's ridiculous. It's beyond belief that that's happening. That, Kenneth Roth he has been the head of Human Rights Watch, I think, longer than Mubarak was in office. When you say it's time for them to leave, it's time for Kenneth Roth to get out of there. I mean, I don't know how long, Phyllis, he has been the head of HRW, but it's forever, and he writes really horrible things on his social media, really horrible things. They're embarrassing. Even Pompeo doesn't go that far as Kenneth Roth sometimes. So, I mean, you have a situation where we have to introspect, we have to find a way to reach people. And, we're asking for these doctors to get the Nobel Prize. Why are their eyebrows raised? There is a record of what they did with Ebola. There's a record of what they're doing in South America with COVID-19. These are really nice people. Forget anything else. I've met these Cuban doctors in the Harry. They're really nice people, for God's sake. This should make us think a million times, not from a position of futility and defeat and so on, but we are realistic people. Our utopia is realistic. We believe in it. So we need to sit back and think, why is it that when a nut like Trump says these nut things, that Kenneth Roth and people go and line up behind Trump? What's going on here? And that's what we need to think about really a lot. We can't continue to, spin the wheels and say, if we just go back to the people again, we'll win the hearts of the people. Why are the people not coming here? Why are they going there? And I know Brecht's poem, if you don't like the people, elect a new people. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm trying to understand, what is it? Is it that we don't capture the media? Is it that our messages are bad? Or is it something much more grave than that, which is that the collapse of social institutions has collapsed the feeling of social solidarity, and building the sense of social solidarity is such an important part of our work. In a pandemic, we are struggling to build solidarity in this distanced way. But I think that to me explains some of it, is that building again the fabric of social life might build the consciousness of social solidarity. If you wrench the fabric of social life, you break the concept of social solidarity. I think this is at least the beginning for me to try to think about why our ideas don't grip. I don't mean to sound pessimistic, Jody. I really am not being pessimistic. I'm saying, it's the opposite of Mary Poppins. It's not a spoonful of sugar to get the medicine down. It's a spoonful of medicine to get the sugar down. Our sugar is socialism. We need a spoonful of realism to advance the cause of socialism. You can't advance a socialist cause just by dreaming. We have to look at reality in the face and say, what's going on? And I think, we are smart, compassionate people. We can figure this out. And we are on the right track. It's not that we have to pivot anywhere. We have to just figure out, how do we hug people closer to our chests and make them feel our heartbeat, and then harmonize that and create a new world.
Oh my God, Vijay, thank you so much. That was so inspiring. Thank you both of us for joining us. Thank you so much. Bye, Vijay. Bye, Phyllis. Thank you so much.
Bye, Phyllis. Bye.
So next I want to bring up Katie Seeger. Katie has been birthing and organizing the Feminist Foreign Policy Project at CODEPINK, which is working to share knowledge and connections for anti-imperialist feminists. And she's working with feminists around the world. And maybe Katie, bring us into how do we look through the lens of a feminist foreign policy at what's happening?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jody. I'm really excited to talk about feminist foreign policy tonight. Last night, I was able to listen in on what some people had to say about a post-Trump Biden-Harris foreign policy. And not that anyone here is shocked, but it's not shaping up to be what we hoped for. But before, I begin, I really just want to take a moment to remember Vanessa Guillen, a woman soldier who was murdered for coming forward about the sexual violence she experienced at Fort Hood in Texas, because it's just so indicative of what happens to women under militarism and patriarchy, which are one and the same. So I just wanted to take a moment to remember her. But on the subject of what's been said about foreign policy, one of the first things you'll notice, and something that I definitely noticed, is that foreign policy and feminism and women's issues are completely separated. There's no mention of a feminist foreign policy, which frankly, part of me is grateful for, because there hasn't been a co-optation of it yet. But we can still articulate what an actual feminist foreign policy is. What you'll see has been appropriated, though, is a progressive foreign policy. Last night in the panel, I watched Senator Chris Murphy, who was the guest of honor, more or less, who also stood up and admitted earlier this year that the coup in Venezuela was absolutely planned by the US and that he really hoped that it would have succeeded. He really drove home the point that Democrats need to be a party of national security and also have a progressive foreign policy. But those of us who know history know that those two things can't really exist, especially when feminist issues are involved, because we've seen what it looks like before, and it's the oppression of Afghan women being used to defend the invasion of Afghanistan. It's not feminist foreign policy. It's imperialist feminist foreign policy with a very, very, very thin coat of like feminist paint. And at the same time, there was this talk of decreasing our spending on weapons, which sounded great, at first glance. But then Senator Murphy expanded on what he meant by that. And it was made really clear that what was meant was spending less on weapons and diverting that money to be spent on programs that encourage democracy and healthcare through the military. We know what that's code for, especially when people say we're supporting democracy. It's a code word for regime change wars. And putting healthcare in the hands of the military sends a really dangerous message. The focus that is had right now on a post-Trump foreign policy for a Biden-Harris administration is to really repair the US's image through soft power, which was mentioned earlier when people were when I think Phyllis was talking about this return to American exceptionalism. And I think people have really started to feel the blow of what Trump has, how Trump has made the US look like on the global stage. But the focus is not on building peace, it's on repairing that image. And one of the ways that what was talked about doing that was through healthcare, which I think in the moment we're in, everyone is focusing on healthcare right now. And you can continue to put money into the Pentagon. You can't continue to put money into the Pentagon and just move it around and say you're being progressive. Just because you have fewer weapons doesn't mean you have more peace. You just have a pink-washed, a green-washed, a whitewashed form of imperialism that just makes it harder to actually advocate for the feminist foreign policy vision that we have. And so with that in mind, we also really need to be aware, and I'm so glad that Vijay and Phyllis mentioned this, is we need to be really aware of how both Democrats and Republicans really want to have a second Cold War with China. It is one of the speakers, I don't remember who said it last night, but said that we need to compete with China to show how strong and diverse we are. I don't know what that means. China's not our enemy. We can't afford to go down the war path. We need cooperation. And I think this is where you really see the difference between us anti-imperialist feminists and war hawk feminists. We understand that feminism isn't just something you can claim when it personally benefits you. You can't just add the word feminist onto something like foreign policy and then think that magically makes it feminist. You have to live it and you have to engage with it every day. Our vision of feminist foreign policy centers the women and trans people and queer people who are actively suffering because of our patriarchal foreign policy that is so dependent on militarism. You know, women can't be free when their countries are being sanctioned, and because of those sanctions, they can't get tampons. You know, when their homes are being bombed, when their children, like Phyllis mentioned earlier, are being killed. You know, women can only be free when we dismantle the war machine and build something new and something better. And part of what, and I'm really glad that Phyllis mentioned this earlier, part of that needs to be that we need to reignite the peace movement. There's so many young people like myself who have grown up with the US permanently at war. It's just always been something that honestly I kind of just accepted before, you know, I was made aware. We've grown up with the US always at war. But the thing is, young people of my generation, we're also learning. We're learning how insidious militarism is and just how patriarchal it is. You know, because we see how systems of militarism prey on poor kids here, especially poor kids of color, only to prey on poor kids around the world. And I want to second what Phyllis said so beautifully earlier, that we need to expand the definition of who is in the peace movement, because peace is a feminist issue and feminism is a peace issue. We need to make those connections with other issues like what was mentioned earlier, Black Lives Matter, healthcare, colonialism, the environment. And what I think especially needs attention is feminist issues and women's liberation, because they all intersect. All these forms of oppression are, you know, really worsened through militarism. And I think our vision of feminist foreign policy, one that is explicitly anti-imperialist, one that calls for the end of sanctions, really recognizes that.
Thanks, Katie. And I put in the chat where people can find more about the feminist policy at codepink.org/feminist.
Yes, and you can follow us on social media. Our handles are at Feminist4Pol on all platforms. Thanks so much, Jody.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks.
And so Nancy, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sorry, I'm mute. I was on mute, but hi everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around. We want to try to get you out of here before the top of the hour. I know the speeches start very shortly for the third evening of the Democratic National Convention. But what I'd like to do in our time, remainder of time, is connect with our campaign organizers, Katie Town and Leonardo Flores, who will talk to us about ways of getting into action. But not only that, they have done an analysis of the DNC platform. So Carly, how has the Democratic National Convention addressed our $740 billion Pentagon budget?
Hi, Nancy. Yeah, thank you so much. And so, you know, first I'd say if you have been watching the Democratic National Convention, if you've read through the DNC platform, you know, you really get the sense that essentially the Obama administration just didn't happen, right? It's completely ahistorical, refuses to acknowledge or really come to terms with the ways in which the national security apparatus that they critique when Trump uses it was really actually in many ways created and expanded under the Obama administration. Right. So as far as the Pentagon budget goes, we really haven't heard it discussed at all during the actual convention. But if you go ahead and look at the DNC draft platform, it does discuss a little bit and recognize that we spend, quote, 13 times more on the military than we do on diplomacy, but really fails to propose any specific cuts to the Pentagon budget. So it's mostly just talk. But I think something that's really striking about that is, you know, the fact that they're not even touching really on the Pentagon budget comes at a time when this year there was a historic vote in Congress to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. You know, I'm sure many people watching know ultimately that vote failed, but there were 93 votes in the House and 23 in the Senate who voted for it, right? Including many presidential hopefuls, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar in the Senate. But Kamala Harris, who of course is the vice presidential nominee, presumptive nominee, notably did not vote for the 10% cut, right? So in a statement, though, she did say, I unequivocally agree with the goal of reducing the defense budget and redirecting that funding to communities in need, but it must be done, quote unquote, strategically. And future efforts to cut the Pentagon budget will earn my enthusiastic support. So obviously we know she's hedging here, but the fact that the vice presidential nominee even mentions and discusses support for cutting the Pentagon budget should give us some hope, right? And that's all to say that despite the fact that the 10% cut failed in Congress this year, and despite the fact that there's a notable absence of talking about the Pentagon budget at the DNC, there has been historic movement in Congress on this issue, right? And none of this would have been possible without pressure and advocacy from grassroots activists. Of course, CODEPINK helped generate thousands of emails and calls and visits to representatives, and in that process, helped secure more support in Congress to cut the Pentagon budget than I've seen in my lifetime, right? So really moving forward, something I think that's extremely important for people to take away is that we have a real opportunity to continue to organize locally around this issue, right? The 10% budget cut failed this time, but now we have momentum to really start moving our Congress members on this issue. For example, we know the names of every congressperson who voted no on the 10% cut to the Pentagon budget. We also know that anyone who voted no on reducing the Pentagon budget received 3 times the amount of campaign contributions than their colleagues did, right? So with that knowledge, right, it's very clear that politicians are beholden to the people who fund their campaigns. So it's really up to us to hold them accountable and really demand that they stop taking campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers. We already have the tools available for people to reach out to their congressional representatives and ask them to pledge to stop taking campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers and really hold them accountable. So I'm actually going to drop that in the chat right now for people, and we'll make sure people who are watching on social media have it too. They can go there to reach out to their Congress people, demand that they stop taking these campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly, for sharing your analysis on the DNC platform, and also for telling us the different ways of taking action. I just want to let people know that one of our campaigns under the Divest from the War Machine campaign is our BlackRock campaign. And Joe Biden has a very cozy relationship with the CEO of BlackRock, and there are hints of interest from executives from that company to gain a position in the Biden administration if he does indeed win the White House. One of those people at BlackRock who was interested in a position was a person named Brian Deese, who is head of sustainability at BlackRock. Somehow he got on a list of potential Biden appointees, but once large green groups got hold of that list, they said, please remove Brian Deese. BlackRock is the largest investor in climate chaos. Not only that, they are also the largest investor in weapon manufacturers. So that, we have to say, is a victory. And we want to promote that kind of people power and influence, not only in the streets, but in the meetings and offices that happen during these appointments. So I want to go ahead and invite Leonardo to share with us his analysis of the Americas section of the DNC platform and share with us the different ways to take action. Leo?
Thanks, Nancy. So the very first line about Latin America and the Caribbean in the DNC platform says this: Democrats believe the Western Hemisphere is America's strategic home base. So basically the region has gone from being referred to as the backyard of the US to a home base. And I don't really know which one is worse, because the latter sounds very militaristic, and strategic in the sense of strategic resources is probably what they're thinking. And so this is really what Phyllis said. What struck me about the platform being more about kind of recapturing this sense of American exceptionalism. because this line itself, it just sounds so much like more of the Monroe Doctrine that we've seen, which the Obama administration actually had declared dead, but the Trump administration revived. And now it seems like Biden might be kind of reviving it in a slightly different manner. But, you know, as this section, as I analyzed it, there was some good criticism of Trump's coercion of countries like Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which he coerced in order to support his, you know, the third country safe agreements for asylum seekers. But we've got to be honest and say that the alternative offered by Biden when he was vice president was only better on the surface in terms of immigration, because it was the Obama administration that deported millions of people, that also put kids in cages, and that pushed a security-based foreign policy that directly increased U.S. migration to the U.S. The platform continues, and it says it, you know, offers support to indigenous peoples and climate adaptation, and says it will take action to stop deforestation in the Amazon. But there's no mention, say, of the democratic support for coups that are based on resource extraction, whether it's Venezuela's oil or Bolivia's lithium, or mining interests that played a role in the coup in Honduras that happened when Biden was vice president. So you can't be green and support these sort of coups in Latin America, which are all about extracting resources from the ground. You know, and speaking of Venezuela, the DNC platform rightfully calls the Trump administration's policies failed. But then they put forward a strategy that is basically identical to this failed policy. And there's no mention of the brutal sanctions that have killed 100,000 people and cost the economy $194 billion, right? And so Biden and his team criticized Trump for using bellicose threats, but there has been no criticism from any Democrat that I'm aware of for the Trump administration's deployment of the US Navy to the Caribbean as a direct threat to Venezuela. And that's if there is an October surprise, as Vijay and Phyllis warned about, in terms of military action against Venezuela, it's gonna come from the Navy that's deployed there right now. And finally, there was some criticism of the Trump administration with regards to Cuba in that they're, you know, cutting travel and cutting remittances. But the goal of regime change basically remains the same. And the DNC platform says that they are going to empower Cubans to write their own future. And this is such an arrogant point of view, really, because Cubans are already writing their own future. They don't need Democrats or Republicans to do that. And then just quickly moving on to, you know, how the platform relates to work done by CODEPINK, and specifically CODEPINK's Latin America team. One of our major campaigns right now is what we're calling the New Good Neighbor Policy, which is a vision for relations between the US and Latin America and the Caribbean based on 3 principles. The first is not meddling. The second is respecting and appreciating differences. And the third is working together for the common good. So next week, CODEPINK and 100 other organizations are going to send letters to the Biden and Trump campaigns outlining a progressive vision for foreign policy towards the region. The endorsing organizations include, you know, CODEPINK, Global Exchange, the Center on Hemispheric Affairs, the Americas Program, the Center for International Policy, the Latin America Working Group, World Beyond War, Oxfam America, several programs of the Institute for Policy Study, and many more. So we have this building this kind of broad coalition around this New Good Neighbor Policy. The letter calls for ending broad economic sanctions, stopping the policy of militarization, ending political interference, supporting human rights in a non-hypocritical manner, a humane immigration policy, and a fairer trade policy. So there's a lot of excitement around that. And we're building this fantastic coalition of organizations that are going to work on foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Leo. And we have dropped in some links in the chat box for you to access any actions that you can take. If you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, you can visit our CODEPINK website, codepink.org, to learn more about all these incredible campaigns and actions. I want to thank all our speakers today, even our facilitators, Medea Benjamin, Jody Evans, Vijay Prashad, Phyllis Dennis, Katie Seeger, Carly Town, and Leonardo Flores. We had an amazing panel today, and this concludes our discussion, our commentary on the DNC today. and we leave you in enough time to go off and watch it, the third night of the DNC, if you feel moved to do so. But thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thank you and goodbye.